The deep hum of the ship's engines vibrated through Jack's boots as he made his way to the cargo hold. His eyes flickered over the dim control panels as he navigated the dark passage, the faint glow of lights barely cutting through the shadows. Space had a way of making everything feel like a long, empty stretch of time, and tonight was no different. He hadn't intended to take on any more deals, but a desperate transmission from a well-connected contact had caught his attention. A quick payout, they promised. In and out, no questions asked. The cargo? A live specimen, a female alien slave. The kind of thing Jack usually avoided. He wasn't in the business of trafficking living beings, but the offer was too good to pass up. A one-time deal, they said. The door to the cargo hold slid open with a hiss, revealing the figure shackled in the far corner of the room. Jack stopped in his tracks, his breath catching for a moment as he took her in. She was sitting against the cold metal wall, her eyes cast downward, but even in that defeated posture there was something about her, something that didn't fit. Her skin was an ethereal shade of deep violet, and her hair, if you could call it that, was a strange, fluid mass of silver tendrils that seemed to shift with a life of their own. She wore a plain, worn jumpsuit, dirt-streaked from whatever hellish conditions she'd been through. Her eyes, however, her eyes were the strangest part. They were silver too, glinting with an unnatural clarity in the dim light. Jack's first instinct was to look away. Slaves didn't matter to men like him. They were tools. Goods. But as the door shut behind him, sealing him in the cold silence of the hold, he hesitated. He studied her more closely, this time sensing something in the air, an undercurrent of tension, or perhaps power, that he couldn't quite place. "What's your name?" he asked, the rough edge in his voice an attempt to mask the curiosity that was bubbling inside him. She raised her head slowly, her eyes locking onto his. There was no fear in her gaze, only a sharp, almost unnerving calm. "I do not have a name," she replied, her voice smooth, rich, yet clipped. "But you may call me Lyra." "Lyra?" He raised an eyebrow, taking a step forward. "Is that supposed to be some kind of slave name?" She didn't answer immediately, but her lips curled ever so slightly, an almost imperceptible smile playing at the edges. "It is not a name given to slaves. It is mine." Jack stared at her for a moment, the silence between them thick and heavy. He wasn't sure why it unsettled him. Maybe it was the way she spoke, like every word was deliberate, each syllable wrapped in some unspoken weight. Or maybe it was the way she held herself, proud, defiant, as if she didn't belong here at all. "You're a slave," Jack said again, as if saying it would somehow make it true. "You were captured by, what? Some warlord, some bastard out there?" "The usual." Lyra's eyes glinted in the dim light. "I was taken, yes. But I was not captured by just anyone." Jack felt a tightening in his chest, a flicker of doubt creeping in. There was something about her words, her eyes. She wasn't just a broken prisoner. She was playing a game, one he couldn't read. "If you weren't captured by just anyone, then who were you taken by?" Lyra shifted slightly, stretching her long limbs. Her voice remained steady, but Jack noticed a flicker of something behind her eyes, something dangerous. "You wouldn't understand. You are not part of that world." Jack let out a sharp laugh, more out of discomfort than anything else. "What, the world of the rich and powerful? The ones who get away with everything because they have the means to do so?" Her gaze didn't waver. "No. The world of royalty." Jack's footsteps faltered. His hand instinctively went to the gun holstered at his side, though he couldn't quite explain why. "Royalty?" "Yes," Lyra said simply, the word hanging between them like a challenge. "I am the princess of a world far beyond your understanding, Captain." Her voice held no arrogance, only quiet assertion. The air in the room shifted, the words settling like a stone in Jack's gut. He was silent for a moment, taking in her statement, wondering if she was just messing with him, trying to get under his skin. But there was no smirk on her face, no hint of a joke. For the first time, Jack noticed the way the light seemed to bend around her. The way the shadows clung to her skin as though they were afraid to touch her. The unease in his stomach intensified. So what? You're telling me you're some kind of alien royalty? His voice was rough with disbelief. Exactly, she replied, her eyes narrowing just slightly, as if daring him to question her further. Jack took a step back, trying to process her words. There was no way this woman was a princess. She didn't look the part. She didn't act the part. She was a slave, nothing more, nothing less. But something about the way she spoke, the way she held herself, it didn't sit right with him. A low hum vibrated through the ship's hull, and Jack instinctively glanced at the control panel near the door. The ship's systems were operating at full capacity, but something felt off. He glanced back at Lyra. You're not just a slave, are you? Lyra's eyes never left him. No. I am not just a slave. Jack didn't know whether to be pissed off or intrigued. He'd taken her on as a commodity, a trade for quick cash, but now, something felt like it was about to crack wide open. The tension in the room was palpable, like they were both waiting for something. A shift. A revelation. And just then, the ship's alarm blared. The sudden sound cut through the silence like a knife. Lyra's lips curled into a faint, knowing smile. It seems we are no longer alone, Captain. Jack froze. His heart skipped a beat. The universe had a habit of throwing curveballs at him, but this? This was something else. Something big. As the ship's engines groaned and shuddered in the distance, Jack knew one thing for sure. His life was about to change. The alarm's shrill scream still echoed through the ship's corridors, vibrating in Jack's bones like a live wire. His hand instinctively went to his blaster, fingers tightening around the cold metal as he scanned the dim cargo hold. The air was thick with a sudden sense of urgency. Something was wrong. He could feel it deep in his gut. Lyra remained seated against the far wall, her eyes closed as though the chaos didn't touch her at all. The very stillness of her was unnerving. For a moment, Jack almost forgot she was a prisoner, forgot that this alien woman wasn't supposed to be here. The ship's systems hummed louder now, an unnatural whine cutting through the alarm. Jack could feel the vibrations beneath his feet, a tremor that signaled something was coming. His instincts screamed at him to run, to lock down the cargo hold, and keep himself hidden. But instead, his eyes found Lyra once again. She was different. Every time he looked at her, he felt that gnawing sense of wrongness. She wasn't afraid, wasn't cowering like any other slave would. No, Lyra was waiting. Waiting for something. Don't just sit there, Jack barked, snapping the words at her with more force than he intended. Do you hear that? We're under attack, or something's gone wrong. We need to figure out what's going on. Lyra slowly opened her eyes, those silver depths locking onto his with the weight of something older, something wiser. She didn't flinch. Didn't even blink. I know, she said softly, as though the alarm and chaos were a mere backdrop to a story she'd heard 1,000 times. They're here. Jack's chest tightened. He took a step forward, the blaster still raised, eyes flicking to the ceiling. The ship had no windows, just cold steel and a handful of small, flickering lights that illuminated the narrow hallways. But the silence that followed the blaring alarm was unsettling, too still. Too quiet. He glanced back at Lyra, his mouth dry. Who's here? You said? I said they're here. She cut him off. Her voice was calm, almost soothing, but something in her tone stopped him from speaking. Your enemies. Mine too. I wasn't lying to you, Captain. I'm not some simple alien slave. I'm not a thing for you to sell. Yeah? Jack's jaw clenched as the ship's controls buzzed again, a strange electronic screech filling the air. Then what the hell are you, really? Some kind of fugitive princess? Because I don't have the time or the patience to. I'm not your enemy. Lyra interrupted, her voice now firm, but there was a deeper edge to it. A note of finality. The cargo hold door suddenly slammed open with a violent jerk, making Jack jump. 2 figures stood in the doorway, shadowed and menacing, framed by the stark light from the passageway outside. The unmistakable silhouette of armed guards. They were human, dressed in tactical black, weapons drawn and aimed. But Jack wasn't focused on them. His eyes were locked on the insignia they wore, a symbol he'd seen before in whispers, in rumors, from desperate contacts. The New Dominion. Jack's heart dropped into his stomach. "You're with them?" he hissed, disbelief threading through his words. He took a step back, gun still raised. "You're with the fucking Dominion?" Lyra's eyes flickered for a brief moment, something like regret, something like fear. But it was gone before Jack could catch it. She stood up, her movements fluid, controlled, almost graceful, as though she were simply standing to stretch after a long nap. But Jack could feel the shift in the room, the tension thickening, the space between them all shrinking. "I was once," Lyra said quietly, meeting Jack's eyes with a piercing stare. "But I am no longer. Not in the way you think." The guards didn't move, but their eyes never left her. The air crackled with the intensity of the unspoken. Jack's mind raced. The Dominion. They controlled vast sections of the galaxy, their influence reaching even into the black markets where Jack had made most of his life. To cross them was suicide. To have their symbol here, on his ship, was no coincidence. But what did it mean for him? For Lyra? "You're not one of them anymore?" Jack asked, keeping his voice low, laced with suspicion. Lyra tilted her head slightly, her silver eyes glinting like stars in the darkness. "No," she said. "I'm not. But they'll never let me go. You should know that." Jack's pulse quickened. His fingers twitched around the handle of his blaster. He'd been in situations like this before, outnumbered, outgunned, but this? This was different. He wasn't prepared for the complexity of it. Lyra wasn't just some helpless prisoner, and he wasn't just some rogue captain looking to make a quick buck. "Then why the hell didn't you tell me?" Jack growled, moving toward the control panel next to the door, trying to activate the emergency lockdown. His fingers slid over the keys with practiced haste, but the screen flashed red, the systems locked tight. Someone had tampered with the controls. Lyra's gaze softened, and for the first time, she moved closer to him, just a few paces, until she stood directly in front of him. "I didn't tell you because I had to know whether I could trust you first," she said. Her voice was quiet, but the weight of her words was undeniable. "I had to be sure you wouldn't sell me out." The guards outside the door shifted, their boots scraping against the metal floor. One of them spoke, his voice cold. "You have two choices, Princess. Surrender now, and maybe you'll live. Or make us take you." His hand tightened around the grip of his weapon. Jack's eyes flicked between Lyra and the guards, a storm of conflicting thoughts swirling in his head. Lyra had been calm before, but now, there was a fire in her eyes. He couldn't place it, a confidence, a power that had been lurking beneath the surface. She wasn't just a princess. She was a survivor. Maybe even more. The tension in the air snapped when Lyra moved. Before Jack could react, she was on the guards, moving with such speed and precision that it almost seemed like she was 2 steps ahead of them. In an instant she disarmed one of them, the blaster flying from his hands and skidding across the floor. The other guard barely had time to raise his weapon before Lyra twisted his arm behind his back, slamming him into the wall with a sickening thud. Jack froze. His mind struggled to catch up to what his eyes were seeing. This wasn't a helpless princess. This was a force to be reckoned with. Lyra turned toward him, her breath steady, her posture like that of a predator at rest. "They're coming for me, Captain. You need to decide. Will you help me now, or will you let them take me?" The choice was in his hands. And for the first time in his life, Jack wondered if he was ready for the consequences of it. The air inside the cargo hold was thick with the smell of sweat and tension. Jack could hear the sound of his own breathing, shallow and quick, as his pulse thudded in his ears. The 2 guards lay unconscious at Lyra's feet, their bodies crumpled in unnatural angles, but her posture didn't relax. Her silver eyes were still sharp, scanning the shadows beyond the door, waiting for the next threat to emerge. The ship's engines hummed beneath them, a steady rhythm that didn't match the chaos unfolding. A distant voice crackled over the comms, distorted and faint, but Jack could make out the words. This is your last warning, Captain. Surrender the princess, or we will board your ship. Jack's fingers tightened around the grip of his blaster, but his gaze flickered back to Lyra. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was caught in something much larger than he had intended. The new Dominion had made it clear they weren't going to let her go without a fight. But the real question was, what was Lyra willing to do to avoid being taken back? He hadn't expected her to be like this. Not after everything he had heard. The stories of the Dominion's grip on the galaxy, of how they ruled with an iron fist, enslaving people like her. He had seen it firsthand in the black markets. Their reach was impossible to escape. But Lyra? She wasn't just any runaway. She was the one who had escaped. The princess. They won't stop until they have me. Lyra's voice cut through his thoughts, low but steady. You should leave. While you still can. Jack's eyes narrowed. And leave you to them? His voice was harsh, edged with disbelief. He had never been one to run from a fight, especially when it came down to a woman like Lyra. But the stakes were high, too high for him to ignore. You don't understand, she said, stepping toward him, her movements graceful, her eyes never leaving his. The Dominion doesn't just take prisoners. They take lives. They'll torture me, tear me apart, and they'll destroy anyone who gets in their way. You're already in danger. You don't want to be part of this. I'm already part of it, aren't I? Jack replied, his voice low but firm. I've got you on my ship. They're already hunting me. I don't back out of things like this. Not now. Lyra tilted her head slightly, studying him. There was a flicker of something in her eyes, maybe respect, maybe something deeper. But before Jack could make sense of it, the faintest sound of movement reached his ears, coming from just outside the cargo hold. They're here, she whispered, the edge of fear in her voice this time. It was almost imperceptible, but Jack caught it. It wasn't fear of the guards. It was something else. Something more personal. He didn't ask. Instead, he moved toward the control panel, his fingers flying across the touchpad. The ship's internal systems flashed on the screen in front of him, but the lockdown commands were still disabled. The blast doors wouldn't close. The ship wasn't responding. Panic gnawed at his insides, and a cold dread settled over him. They were going to board. We need to move, he said, his tone more urgent now. Lyra's silver eyes met his, and for a moment, the weight of the situation pressed in on both of them. It was clear that she wasn't about to let Jack fight her battles. But something in her expression told him she wasn't just any captive. She was more than that. He wasn't sure why she trusted him, or if she did at all, but they were in this together now. What do you suggest? She asked, her voice soft but strong, laced with a challenge. Jack's mind raced. There were 1,000 ways this could go wrong, but only one way it could go right. The only chance they had was to leave this ship before the Dominion soldiers boarded. He didn't wait for another thought. Jack moved toward the nearest door, grabbing Lyra's arm and pulling her behind him as he sprinted down the narrow corridor. She didn't resist, her feet light against the metal floor, her steps perfectly aligned with his. The sounds of footsteps and voices grew louder as they reached the ship's central hub, the spaceport bay just beyond. Jack's eyes darted between the narrow passageways, weighing his options. They had minutes, maybe less, before the Dominion breached the hull. We'll have to make a break for it, he said, his voice low as he scanned the room ahead. There's a shuttle docked in the lower hangar. It's small, but it'll get us out. Lyra nodded once, her expression steely. I know where it is. Then lead the way. Jack said the words a command, but there was something in his tone that wasn't just business. It was trust. The moment they entered the bay, the ship's alarm blared again, a final, desperate warning. The outer doors hissed as they began to open. Jack's heart pounded in his chest as the dark expanse of space revealed itself beyond the door, the distant stars glittering coldly. But something else caught his eye, a flashing red light in the distance. The shuttle was still there, but there was no time to waste. They had to move fast. Lyra took the lead, her silver eyes scanning every corner of the bay, her movements sharp and calculated. She was no longer the prisoner, the helpless woman Jack had first encountered. She was a woman on the run, and she knew exactly what she was doing. There was no hesitation in her steps, no moment of doubt. The sounds of the Dominion soldiers reached their ears, the unmistakable stomp of boots on metal floors. The enemy was close. Jack glanced at Lyra one last time, something stirring in him, something unspoken, something more than just the desperation of the moment. He knew that this was it. This was the moment that would decide everything. Together they ran. As they neared the shuttle, Jack heard the distinct sound of blaster fire behind them, followed by the crackle of distant voices shouting commands. The storm was closing in, but they were close enough now. The bay doors to the shuttle hangar were just ahead. But as Jack reached for the door control, a voice from behind shouted, "Stop right there!" The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. He didn't need to look to know who it was. And that cold knot in his stomach grew tighter as the last words echoed through the chamber. "This is your final warning. Princess Lyra, you are coming with us." The storm had arrived. The bay doors slid shut behind them with a sharp hiss, the sound of escape echoing in the empty room. Jack's heart raced as he and Lyra dashed toward the shuttle. The distant growls of the Dominion soldiers reverberated through the hallways of the ship. No doubt they'd already breached the cargo hold and were closing in. The shuttle, their only hope, loomed ahead like a lifeline in the darkness. But as Jack reached for the control panel to open the shuttle's hatch, a harsh voice from behind stopped him cold. "I said stop." It was the same voice from earlier, carrying the weight of authority. Jack's hand froze midair, a bead of sweat slipping down his neck. He didn't need to turn around. He knew what was coming. Lyra's grip on his arm tightened, her body tense beside him. There was a flash of something, fear maybe, before her expression settled into something colder, more resolute. "They're not going to let us go," she whispered, almost to herself. The shuttle's engines hummed beneath them, the low vibration of the metal walls keeping them grounded in the present. Jack cursed under his breath, his mind racing through every possible exit strategy. "Lyra," he said, his voice low but steady, "we're not giving up. Not now." But before he could activate the hatch, a heavy footfall echoed across the hangar, then another, until the unmistakable sound of boots clanging on the metal floor filled the space behind him. Jack turned, his muscles coiling in anticipation, his eyes locking with the stormtrooper-like figure standing in the doorway. The leader of the Dominion soldiers. A tall man, clad in black armor, his helmet reflecting the harsh lights overhead, stepped into view. His presence filled the space as though he was the true ruler of this domain. He didn't speak for a moment, letting the tension thicken in the air between them. His fingers twitched near the holster on his waist, the glint of his blaster just visible. "Princess Lyra," the man said, his voice like steel wrapped in velvet, "you're coming with us." Lyra's jaw clenched, her silver eyes glinting with a mixture of anger and resolve. But Jack saw something else there too, something that might have been fear. It flickered for just a second, before it was buried beneath the veneer of defiance. "You've already taken everything from me," she snapped, her voice cutting through the tension. "I'm not going back to that hell." The man's posture remained unmoving, but there was a cruel smile in his tone. "You have no choice." He motioned to the soldiers standing behind him, their blasters trained on them. "The Dominion doesn't take no for an answer." Jack's fingers twitched. This wasn't a conversation. This was a standoff. A decision had to be made. There was no negotiation with these people. Lyra's eyes flicked to him, a silent plea in her gaze. But it wasn't just fear anymore. There was something else there, trust. The kind of trust that only came when two people had shared the kind of hell they'd been through together. And in that moment, Jack realized something. He wasn't just running with her because it was the right thing to do. He was running with her because, somehow, she had become his reason. And he would be damned before he let the Dominion take her back. "We're leaving," Jack said, his voice low, but his certainty clear. He didn't wait for Lyra's response. He spun on his heel, drawing his blaster in one fluid motion. In a blur of motion, he fired. The bolt hit the ground beside the soldier in the front, a warning shot. His gaze never left the leader's face. The man's lip curled beneath his helmet. "You think you can stop us?" "I think," Jack said, his voice level, "that if you don't get out of our way, we're going to make this very difficult for you." There was a heartbeat of silence. The soldiers shifted uneasily, but the leader raised a gloved hand, signaling them to hold. "You don't understand," he said, a strange sadness in his voice now, though it was masked by the authority. "You think you're helping her. But you're only prolonging her suffering. The Dominion has already made plans for her. She can't escape." Jack's eyes flicked to Lyra, who stood silent but unyielding beside him. She didn't flinch, her chin raised high, her gaze never leaving the man in front of her. "No one decides my fate but me," Lyra said, her voice a cold, sharp edge. The leader's eyes darkened. His voice lowered, taking on a quieter, more dangerous tone. "You're mistaken. You were born into this life, Princess. It's not a choice. It's destiny." Jack's blood ran cold. He knew that tone. It was the voice of someone who thought they had all the answers. But in Lyra's eyes, Jack saw something else, something that gave him a spark of hope in this oppressive dark. "Lyra," he said, his voice soft but urgent. "We don't have time for this." She turned to face him, her expression unreadable for a moment. Then, her gaze hardened as though she had made a decision. She nodded. "Let's go." And with that, she moved. In one swift motion, Lyra leapt into action, her hands reaching for the soldier closest to her. She was a blur of movement, disarming the man before he even had a chance to raise his blaster. She spun, knocking another soldier off balance with a kick that sent him sprawling across the floor. Jack didn't hesitate. He fired again, this time aiming for the leader's weapon. The shot hit its mark, disintegrating the blaster in a flash of light. The leader hissed, his hands rising instinctively to the empty holster. His soldiers were scrambling, trying to regain control, but Lyra and Jack were already in motion. They were both running now, toward the shuttle, toward their only chance. The doors slid open in front of them with a soft hiss, and Jack didn't even look back. He could feel the heat of the Dominion's pursuit at their heels, but they were inches from freedom. A sudden sound, a distant rumble from the ship's engines, told him everything he needed to know. The Dominion wasn't far behind. And yet there was something else in the air now, a burning need to break free, to push forward no matter the cost. Because for the first time in a long while, Jack didn't just want to survive. He wanted to win. And with Lyra at his side, he might just have a chance. But the question still hung in the air, what would happen if they didn't make it?